January 1945. Somewhere behind the Allied lines in Western Europe, the German prisoners stand quietly, hands numb in the winter air. Their uniforms are worn, but their posture is still intact. A few exchange glances. One smiles faintly. Another shrugs. This war, they believe, has already shown its limits. They have fought the British. They have endured the Russians. The Americans, many of them think, are loud, rich, inexperienced. Then the trucks begin to pass. They do not stop. They do not slow. Columns of vehicles stretch beyond the horizon. Fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, mobile kitchens, ambulances, tank transporters rolling with mechanical certainty. Above them, the sky is not empty. Bombers pass in steady formations, not rushing, not straining, but moving as if on a schedule no one here can interrupt. The prisoners stop smiling. This is not an army improvising. This is not a nation scraping for survival. This is a machine that replaces losses without emotion, that feeds divisions as easily as it fuels engines, that turns time itself into an advantage. And for the first time, the Germans understand something they were never trained to fight. That realization begins long before defeat ended. Begins with context. When the war began in September 1939, Germany did not merely believe it was strong. It believed it was optimized. Every victory reinforced a dangerous conclusion, that modern war could be won through speed, discipline, and operational brilliance rather than raw industrial depth. Poland collapsed in weeks. France in 6. Norway, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia, Grisic campaign seemed to confirm the same lesson. German officers studied maps, not factories. They measured success in kilometers advanced. Divisions encircled, governments toppled. The Blitzkrieg was not just a tactic. It was a worldview. To German planners. The First World War had proven something essential. Germany had not lost because its soldiers were inferior. It had lost because it was strangled by blockade, by shortages, by time. The solution, they believed, was not to outproduce the enemy, but to defeat him before production mattered. This belief shaped everything. German industry was sophisticated but limited. The Reich relied on specialized production rather than mass standardization. Tanks like the Panzer III and IV were well designed but produced in relatively small numbers. Aircraft were technologically advanced but complex to manufacture and maintain. Ammunition types varied. Spare parts were not interchangeable across models. Efficiency was sacrificed for refinement. Early victories masked these weaknesses. By 1941, German officers had grown accustomed to seeing enemy armies collapse while their own supply lines stretched thin, yet somehow held. They had learned to live with scarcity, to treat improvisation as a virtue. Fuel shortages were managed. Ammunition was rationed. Repairs were done in the field. The system seemed fragile, but it worked. And then Germany turned east. Operation Barbarossa was conceived as the ultimate expression of German confidence. The Soviet Union would fall. They believed, just as France had through encirclement, shock, and speed. Millions of men crossed the border in June 1941. For months, the results appeared to justify the gamble. Entire Soviet armies were destroyed. Cities fell. Prisoners marched west by the hundreds of thousands. But something had changed. Distances were greater. Roads were worse. Rail gauges were incompatible. Fuel ran short more often. Winter came early. Losses mounted not catastrophically at first, but steadily. Tanks broke down faster than they could be replaced. Aircraft wore out. Train crews disappeared into the earth. Still, Germany fought on with confidence because it believed its enemies were weaker. Britain, blockaded and bombed, seemed contained. The Soviet Union, though vast, appeared inefficient and brittle. And the United States, though rich, remained an abstraction. A nation across the ocean. A country of factories and money, not of war. When America entered the conflict in December 1941, German leadership did not panic. In fact, many welcomed it. They believed the United States would take years to mobilize. They believed American society lacked the discipline for prolonged sacrifice. They believed American equipment was crude, American soldiers untested, American command inexperienced. The United States? In turbu was a future problem, one Germany would never allow time to materialize. But war is not decided by belief alone. While German divisions fought and bled across thousands of kilometers, something else was happening quietly, far from the front lines. No victories were announced. No territories seized. No armies encircled. Yet every hour, the balance was shifting. And Germany did not see it coming because it was not looking in the right direction. The next part of this story does not begin at the front. It begins in places German intelligence underestimated. Shipyards, rail yards, assembly lines, and ports where a different kind of army was forming. America did not enter the war with a roar. It entered with schedules. In 1942, while German divisions fought in the snow outside Moscow and the deserts of North Africa, the United States was not focused on winning battles. It was focused on building capacity. The American approach to war was fundamentally different, not faster, not cleverer, but deeper. Factories that had once produced automobiles were stripped and rebuilt. Civilian production was halted almost overnight. Typewriters, refrigerators, and washing machines vanished from store shelves, replaced by tanks, aircraft engines, and artillery shells. Entire industries were reorganized under centralized planning, not for elegance, but for volume. The goal was not superiority. The goal was inevitability. By mid-1942, American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than German submarines could sink them. Some yards reduced construction time from months to weeks. A vessel lost at sea was not mourned, it was replaced. Convoys multiplied. Routes adapted. Losses became data points, not disasters. German intelligence observed these numbers, but failed to grasp their meaning. To German planners, production figures were abstract. They had never fought an enemy whose losses were irrelevant. In their experience, attrition mattered. A destroyed tank meant a weakened unit. A lost aircraft meant a reduced sortie rate. In the American system, destruction triggered replenishment, not collapse. Aircraft production revealed this most clearly. In 1941, Germany still fielded one of the most formidable air forces in the world. But by 1943, American factories alone were producing tens of thousands of aircraft annually. Fighters, bombers, transports built to standardized designs with interchangeable parts, supported by training pipelines that delivered crews faster than they could be lost. The skies began to change. American bombers did not appear as rare events. They appeared in patterns, predictable, relentless. When one formation was intercepted, another followed. When losses were heavy, replacements arrived. German pilots noticed something unsettling. The enemy did not adjust tactics out of fear. It adjusted production on the ground. The same logic applied to American divisions arriving in North Africa and later in Italy were not improvised formations. They came with excess extra vehicles, spare radios, redundant supply units. German officers watching from the other side of the line found this wasteful, even laughable. Why bring more than necessary? Why deploy so much for so little ground? They did not yet understand the doctrine. American logistics were not designed to sustain the minimum force required. They were designed to sustain every force that might be required later. Roads were widened, ports were expanded. Stockpiles were built far beyond immediate need. Fuel was stored in quantities that seemed irrational. To the German mind, trained in scarcity, this appeared inefficient. In reality, it was preparation. By late 1943, the industrial tide was no longer hidden. It was visible from the air, from the sea, and increasingly from the ground. German soldiers captured in North Africa and Italy began reporting unfamiliar sights. Endless truck convoys, airfields packed to wing depots stacked higher than cities. Some laughed. Some dismissed it as overconfidence, but a few began to understand. This was not an army meant to win a single campaign. This was an army meant to outlast everything, and soon that realization would no longer come from reports or rumors but from direct exposure, face to face, behind the wire. That is where the tone of the war begins to change. For many German soldiers, the war had been reduced to endurance. By 1943, capture was no longer rare, and surrender no longer carried the same stigma it once had. Prisoners expected boredom, discomfort, uncertainty. What they did not expect was exposure. Captured Germans moving through Allied rear areas were often transported past things they had never seen before. Vehicle parks that seemed to have no edges, rows of trucks identical down to the bolt, food depots where supplies were stacked faster than they could be consumed, medical stations equipped not merely to treat wounds, but to rotate men back into service with astonishing speed. Some prisoners joked at first. They mocked American excess. Too many trucks, too much food, too many men standing around doing nothing. To soldiers accustomed to operating on shortages, abundance looked like inefficiency. But jokes require comparison. As days passed, the comparison became unavoidable. Prisoners noticed how often units rotated, how quickly damaged equipment vanished and reappeared, repaired, how casually Americans spoke about losses as if replacements were expected, not hoped for. Guards were relaxed, not because they were careless, but because they were not stretched thin. One German non-commissioned officer later recalled that the most unsettling thing was not the treatment, it was the calm. The Americans did not behave like men fighting for survival. They behaved like men executing a plan already funded, supplied, and timed. For prisoners trained to read morale, this was disturbing. The smiles faded not because of fear, but because of Germany built weapons. America built systems. German industry prized engineering excellence. American industry prioritized replication. A Sherman tank was not superior to a Panther in armor or firepower, but it was easier to build, easier to repair, and easier to replace. That difference mattered more than specifications ever could. By 1943, American factories were producing tanks, trucks, and aircraft at a scale that defied traditional military logic. Vehicles were shipped overseas already packaged with spare parts. Crews trained on standardized platforms. Repairs followed manuals designed for speed, not perfection. The battlefield result was subtle but decisive. American units could afford mistakes. They could absorb losses. They could attempt maneuvers that would be unacceptable to armies operating on scarcity. A broken truck was an inconvenience, not a crisis. A destroyed tank was a report, not a catastrophe. German officers observing this through reconnaissance, intercepted communications, or captivity began to grasp a harsh truth. Tactical brilliance loses meaning when the enemy can replace everything you destroy before nightfall. This was not courage. This was capacity. German doctrine emphasized decisive engagement, encirclement, destruction. End the battle quickly. Move on. American doctrine, shaped by logistics, emphasized sustainability. Hold ground. To Hermann eyes, this seemed slow, cautious, almost timid, until it worked. American advances rarely outran their supplies. When they paused, it was not due to exhaustion, but scheduling. Fuel arrived. Ammunition followed. Air support appeared on time. The tempo was deliberate, unstoppable. German commanders began to realize they were no longer fighting for territory. They were fighting against time. And time, backed by factories and ships, was no longer neutral. It was hostile. As this understanding spread from POW cages to command briefings, the laughter vanished. Confidence turned into calculation. Calculation into silence. But human observation was only the beginning. The deeper shock came when German leadership itself was forced to confront what its soldiers were already sensing through reports, interrogations, and the unignorable evidence of a war that refused to slow down. That realization reshapes the next angle. By late 1943, German commanders were receiving reports that no longer aligned with their assumptions. Interrogations of American prisoners revealed nothing extraordinary about tactics or individual training. What stood out instead was consistency. Units arrived fully equipped. Losses were acknowledged without drama. Requests for supplies were fulfilled with alarming speed. This conflicted sharply with German experience. German commanders were trained to fight scarcity. They planned operations around fuel limits, ammunition ceilings, and maintenance bottlenecks. Every offensive calculation involved risk not just of defeat, but of depletion. Yet American forces operated as if those limits did not exist. Some German officers dismissed the reports as exaggeration. Others blamed temporary advantages. But as campaigns stretched from North Africa into Italy and air power expanded across occupied Europe, the pattern became undeniable. The Americans were not improvising. They were executing a design already completed. Field commanders began requesting impossible solutions: more fuel, more aircraft, more replacements, only to be told the Reich could not provide them. Meanwhile, the enemy seemed to receive everything it asked for, exactly when it asked for it. This asymmetry was not tactical, it was structural, and structures do not bend under pressure, they endure. Italiano. Early German propaganda portrayed American soldiers as soft, undisciplined, dependent on technology rather than skill. For a time, this narrative held. American setbacks in North Africa reinforced it. Inexperience was visible, mistakes were made. But mistakes were corrected at scale. Training programs expanded, doctrine adjusted, equipment improved. What Germany mistook for weakness was adaptation, and adaptation, powered by industry, accelerates faster than courage alone ever can. German soldiers noticed something else. American units learned from losses without becoming cautious. Where other armies grew careful, Americans grew systematic. Failures were studied, not feared. Solutions were implemented across entire formations simultaneously. This was unfamiliar. The enemy was no longer an opponent to be out. It was a process, one that absorbed shock, refined itself, and returned stronger without emotional fatigue. At some point, German intelligence stopped describing American forces as inexperienced. They began describing them as inexhaustible. That word carried weight. Morale in war depends on belief. Belief that suffering has meaning, that endurance will be rewarded, that the enemy will eventually weaken. Against America's industrial system, that belief. German soldiers could endure hunger, cold loss. What they struggled to endure was futility. Every bridge destroyed was rebuilt. Every aircraft shot down was replaced by two more. Every convoy sunk was followed by another, larger than the last. The war no longer felt winnable through sacrifice alone. This realization did not arrive as panic. It arrived as resignation, a quiet understanding that bravery, skill, and discipline were no longer enough. That victory now required something Germany did not possess and could not create in time. And when belief collapses, so does momentum. By the time German forces began retreating on multiple fronts, many already knew the outcome. Not because of a single defeat, but because they were facing an enemy whose strength was not measured in men or machines, but in permanence. That permanence would soon be revealed in its most undeniable form, not in reports or rumors, but in a moment when exposure became unavoidable. It arrived in transit. As Allied armies advanced across France in 1944, German prisoners were moved deeper behind. When flak found its mark, replacements arrived the next day, indistinguishable from those lost. For German prisoners, this was no longer abstract. They were inside the mechanism. Some stopped speaking altogether. Others asked questions not about the front, but about factories, about shipping, about how many more divisions were coming. Guards rarely answered. They did not need to. The answer was visible everywhere. This was the point where confidence finally died. Not under fire, not under interrogation, but under the weight of certainty. Germany was not losing a campaign. It was being overtaken by a system that could not be outrun. And yet, even this was only the beginning of the shock. Because the true climax came when German leadership itself was forced to confront what its soldiers had already seen, to realize there was no countermeasure left to deploy. By late 1944, German leadership was no longer debating how to defeat the United States. The question had shifted to how long resistance could be maintained. The data no longer allowed optimism. Production reports told a brutal story. American aircraft output exceeded German losses faster than Luftwaffe units could be reconstituted. Tank production favored quantity over refinement, and the battlefield confirmed the logic, where German armored units waited for replacement vehicles that never arrived. American formations absorbed losses and continued forward without pause. Captured German officers, once defiant, became analytical. Interrogations revealed no secret weapons, no decisive doctrines to counter the industrial imbalance. Instead, they spoke of timing, scale, and inevitability. The war, they admitted, had become unwinnable the moment America's factories reached full momentum. Even propaganda struggled to adapt. Claims of American softness rang hollow against the evidence of relentless pressure. Cities burned not from daring raids, but from sustained air campaigns that did not slacken. Rail yards were repaired and destroyed again, in cycles that exhausted German repair crews faster than Allied bombers could be stopped. On T ground, the effect was equally decisive. German units facing American forces reported a strange pattern. There were no desperate assaults, no reckless pushes. Advances came when supplies were ready, stopped when they were not, and resumed without emotion. Every retreat revealed another prepared line, another stockpile, another wave waiting its turn. The laughter of early captivity vanished. In its place was silence not born of fear, but of comprehension. German soldiers understood they were no longer participants in a contest of skill. They were witnesses to a demonstration of what happens when war is transformed into production, and production is insulated from loss. By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine, few German commanders believed defeat could be avoided. They fought because duty required it, not because victory remained conceivable. The turning point had passed long before the final battles. It passed the moment Germany realized it was fighting an enemy that could not be exhausted. What followed was not collapse, but consequence. When the fighting began to recede in early 1945, the scale of what had occurred became measurable. Germany had not simply been defeated on the battlefield. It had been surpassed in every dimension that sustained warfare. American forces advanced with momentum that no longer depended on tactical surprise. Bridges were built faster than they could be destroyed. Roads were repaired under fire. Fuel shortages, which once dictated the pace of German operations, ceased to exist for the Allies. The front moved not in bursts, but in steady, scheduled increments. German resistance, though often fierce, lacked elasticity. Units that took losses could not be rebuilt. Veteran formations were diluted with under-trained replacements or dissolved entirely. Equipment shortages forced commanders to abandon positions, not because they were untenable, but because they were unsustainable. The numbers told the story without emotion. By the final year of the war, American industry was producing aircraft, vehicles, and munitions in quantities that rendered German counterproduction irrelevant. The Luftwaffe's decline was not caused by a single defeat, but by an inability to replace pilots and planes at the rate they were lost. German armored forces, once feared, became immobilized by fuel scarcity and maintenance collapse. Captured German officers later acknowledged that the Allied advance into Germany felt less like an invasion and more like an extension of a process already in motion. Supply lines did not strain as they lengthened, te improved. Each captured city became a logistics hub. Each repaired rail line multiplied capacity. For soldiers who had once smiled in captivity, the end came without surprise. The realization had already occurred months earlier, when laughter gave way to arithmetic. The war ended not with a final revelation, but with confirmation. Yet the aftermath was not only measured in destroyed armies and occupied territory. Its deeper consequences unfolded after the guns fell silent, when reflection replaced resistance, and Germany began to confront not just how it lost, but why. That reckoning defines the final stage of the aftermath. In the months following Germany's surrender, the tone of German reflection changed. Military defeat was obvious. What required explanation was its scale and its inevitability. Post-war interrogations, memoirs, and internal assessments revealed a consistent conclusion among German officers. The war had been lost long before Berlin fell, not because of a single failed operation, nor because of one overwhelming battle, but because Germany had misjudged the nature of modern war itself. German generals spoke candidly about industry, about shipping, about manpower. They admitted that no level of tactical brilliance could compensate for an opponent capable of replacing entire divisions while fighting on multiple continents. The American system, POWs America, did not gamble. It accumulated. One senior German officer later remarked that the decisive American weapon was not the bomber or the tank, but the calendar. Every month, the war continued. The imbalance grew worse. Time favored the side that could turn loss into output on Germany, could not. For former prisoners of war, this understanding was deeply personal. Many recalled the moment their confidence evaporated not at surrender, but during captivity. Seeing the rear areas, the depots, the endless movement, they realized they were not being held by a stretched occupier, but by a force operating well within its means. The psychological aftermath lingered. German soldiers returned home to ruins, knowing that defeat had not come from a lack of courage. It had come from a mismatch between